Right, so good morning, everybody, once again. This is lecture 19, and in this lecture, we will be talking about classes again. And this is like more of a review class, I would say, in the sense that we'll repeat a lot of things that we already talked about classes in the previous lecture. And in addition to that, I will talk through this example that utilizes this restaurant class. And the goal here is to get you acquainted with different ways in which we can use classes. Why? Because that will be extremely useful, I would say, when you start working on your homework 8. That's the last homework that's coming up, right? Because that involves classes, of course. And it's not just like one class that's important, but also the fact that once you write a class, you also need to understand how classes interact with one another, and how to use them, what techniques can be utilized. And so like the example that we're going to look at today, which is like the restaurant class, of course, it shouldn't limit the way you are thinking about a problem. In fact, it should just like give you one perspective of looking at this problem, and there can be like 100 other ways of doing the same thing, right? So let me give you an overview of what we'll do today. So we'll review classes, of course, and we'll also talk through the Point2d class that we looked at earlier in lecture 18. Then we'll start looking at Yelp data again. If you remember, Yelp had a restaurant-related data, and what we were doing we were like parsing the file, reading every line, and then utilizing that data from every line to calculate things like average rating, getting the name of the restaurant, etc. Right? So in this case, what we'll do is we'll create a restaurant class, and you will see how convenient this becomes, because then when you're writing a restaurant class, you don't have to think about the format in which your input data is presented to you. Although we know that we have like this flat file, we have this like txt file with one line um, that has some information, and then based on the way the information is structured, we are parsing that file, right? But once you have the ability to write a class, you can use that in any format the data is presented to you. That's what we are looking at. And then we'll also talk about like calling class methods from within class. Here, this is similar to something that we looked at called modules. Remember? So in modules you had functions, but now in modules you can also have classes. And just like you called functions from those modules, you can call classes. That's what we look at in this one. And then class objects storing other objects such as lists. So that's possible, of course. And I think we touched upon that when we said when you're using the init method, it's not like just restricted to creating some like one form of variable, for example, just strings or float or integers, but it can be a list as well. It can be a tuple as well. So we'll see all of that today, right? But before we begin, let's review the Point2d class that we looked at last time. And anybody remembers what kind of attributes we created in our Point2d class? What were attributes, and what attributes did we create in Point2d class? Go here. Rochelle, yes. So those were the excellent, Daniel, Rochelle, both of you are right. You're saying X and Y, which is perfect because these were the data attributes. And then there were the procedural attributes, right? Or methods. So yes, the data attributes were X and Y. And then the procedural attributes were like we were trying to find the magnitude of the point and then the distance of the point. And then we had some special methods. Again, those are also attributes. And those special methods were like adding 2 points, subtracting 2 points. And let's talk through this again one more time, because this is important when we start looking at the restaurant class. And these files, by the way, are provided to you. They are there on Submitty. There's this lecture 19_zip or something, lecture 19 files.zip, that you can download from Submitty, and it has like the files that we'll be looking at throughout the lecture. Okay, so first, this is my Point2d class, which is nothing but a new object that I've created. And I decided that it's going to be a two-dimensional point, which means that I just need to initialize X and Y, right? And feel free to like ask questions here, because I know I received a lot of emails from many of you asking for like the intricacies of many of the methods. So if you still have doubts, you can definitely ask now. There is like no issue at all in repeating, because this is important. That's what I'm saying. All right. So then we decided here, and like after some discussion, that the magnitude is going to be the distance from the origin, and all we did was we found like a formula or an expression for that. The things to note here, right? The first, the underscore init method here, the first one, right? That initializes the variables, and that is going to be there all the time. So whenever you create a class, this has to exist because your data attributes will be defined here, right? Now this is optional, what we're saying here, x0 equals 0, because here I'm saying initialize it, right? But if you don't want to initialize it, that's also fine, except that when you try to like create an instance of this point2d, you will always have to specify like what is x and what is y. Let's say if you don't, then it will error out. That's the only catch here, but that's fine. This is optional. And then all you have to do is utilize this keyword self and do a self.x and just assign these values to your x and y. And why are we doing this assignment within this init class? That is because, of course, we will be utilizing it within the class, right? So every time we utilize any aspect, for example, data attributes or procedural attributes within my class, right? I have to use this keyword self. Always remember that. So that kind of tells us that self is an instance of my class. It could be anything. I don't know what the value of x and y would be for that instance, but we're just like trying to represent an instance of my class. Just imagine that. Okay, so when I'm creating like my own method or my own function in my point2d class, again, I have to give self as the first argument because this method or this function is going to work on that instance of my class, right? So for instance, let me just like run this. And of course, I have like the driver code, right? So these are the instances of the class that I'm creating. And sometimes I might need two instances of my class. So in that situation, for example, add, or for example, we did one more, dist, right, where we were calculating the distance between 2 points, then I have to refer to two instances of the class. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense when I'm calculating the distance between point A and point B, right? So in order to represent that, I have self and other, or O. And then within the function or the method, right, I will refer to one instance as self, the other instance as O. Okay. Now, important things to like again notice here are, first of all, the init method, which is extremely important. The others are like self-defined functions. So these are up to us what functionality we want to add. Again, we had scale, dominates, but there are certain special methods. And these special methods are important because they have to be used in a certain way. For instance, like one of the special method was underscore add. And whenever you're adding this like in your class, that means you're referring to this existing, let me just write it down. So you are essentially referring to this existing plus sign, right? And this plus sign has a meaning in Python. For example, when I do a 5 plus 4, these types are important, right? So I know that this is an int type, and this is also an int type. So an int plus int is again going to be like an int type, right? So whenever I'm using an add, underscore add in my code, in my class, that means I'm referring to this plus sign, right? And I have to be extremely careful in defining what exactly should I return when like 2 points of type point2d, for example, p1 equals like point 2d something, I don't know, 4, 5, and p2 again point 2d some other 9, 6, right? When I have p1 and p2, what should happen when p1 plus p2 is done? That's what this means, right? And what I want is that it should again return a type point2d, right? And whenever we are like referring to point2d as a type, it requires two arguments, right? Because that's how I define my point2d. And so that's exactly what we are giving it here. I have to give it two arguments, which is nothing but the sum of the x of p1 and p2 and the y's of like p1 and p2. Right? And similar to that, we used other like special methods. For example, underscore sub is for like subtraction, and this is for multiplication. So these are like, why these are special methods? Because they already exist in Python, right? They already have a certain meaning for other object types, for existing object types, right? And we have to build on that. So we are like kind of trying to overload my operator. Sometimes, like in some languages, this is also referred to as that, that we are overloading this operator. But in this, like essentially what we're doing is we are defining that this special sign or this special operator has to be used in this way for my object. All right. So that's all fine. And then yeah, this is something that we always need to be careful about. Whenever we are using a print on the object type that we have created, we have to specify what that print should print out, because print is nothing but a standard output, right? So print doesn't know on its own what your point2d object is unless you specify it in the string method or the __ str. So this is extremely crucial, just like the init method. And in fact, so much so that like I would recommend everybody to when they start writing classes, begin with init, and the second one should always be like this str, because like you really get like involved with other methods and other functionality in your class, and you just like forget how the print should work with your class, right? So it's always a good idea to do this str. Sometimes I understand that it's not required, but it's a good idea to have some kind of like an str method there, so that when you're using a print on like one of the instances of your class, you know what will be printed, right? So have that str as well. And we'll look at that. Like there are many different ways of doing it. Essentially, you have to create a string with some variables that you want to be printed. It's totally up to you what you want your print method, your print function to print when you're like trying to print an instance of your class. For example, I could have decided not to print y. It's totally up to me what exactly am I trying to print. So there is no rule here as such. All right, so this was a quick like overview of like how to write classes, and we'll look at one example in greater detail today, which is the restaurant class. So let me go back there. Before that, let me take questions if there are any. No, I'm not seeing any questions, so that's okay. Now, but if you have like, even if it's from the previous lecture, feel free to ask it today, because I know that classes are initially overwhelming, and homework 8 will involve classes, and you will be writing a lot of classes. So like today's lecture is really important from that perspective. And we have like the lab this week as well that asks you to work on classes. So that should give you enough practice. All right, so we talked about this Point2d class that we wrote last time. And now we are going to look at this larger example that I was talking about, right? Remember the Yelp data? So each line looked something like this as shown here, right? So we had like the name of the restaurant, the latitude, the longitude, and then some address, right? Website. Okay, no, I don't want. I don't know. Yeah, okay, maybe I clicked the link. So the link to the website, the category, like it's a Greek restaurant, and then all these like ratings, right? And the way we were parsing this Yelp data was that we were like going and looking at the data, and then we found that we can like do a dot split by these delimiters, the pipe delimiters, and then we knew like what is the position of these, right? And based on the position, we were trying to extract certain information. Now, sometimes like you can still get similar data with similar fields, but maybe it's not the same format as this. The file format is not the same as this, right? Or maybe there is something different in the way this thing is stored. Maybe it's a JSON file, right? You're working on homework 7 with the JSON. So of course, like we cannot directly go and do what we want to do with this, right? So a better method is to go and create a restaurant class that will be independent of what input you give it, right? And then maybe have a different file or a different code that will do the reading of the code, the reading of the file, depending on like how the file is stored. So let me first give you a high level idea before jumping into the code, because this becomes like really overwhelming initially. So let me just like write it somewhere. Okay, just remove this. Okay, so let me tell you what exactly we're trying to do and why we're doing it with classes today. All right, so I have like this Yelp data, right? I know that I have this known file format, and let's say I found out that it is a .txt file, right? So I'm trying to be like more generic in the sense that I don't want my restaurant class to any like ways. Let's say this is my restaurant class that I'm of course going to write, right? And it should be independent of the way the data is coming. So basically this restaurant class, of course, I know that the restaurant needs to have a name. It will have like some ratings. It will have all the other information that's there in the Yelp data. But the whole point of creating that generic class is that maybe Yelp data wasn't TXT. Maybe it was JSON. Maybe it was a Python file. I don't know what it is going to be. So I'm going to make that independent. Regardless, right now I have a TXT file, right? So because I know that I have a TXT file, what I can do is I can introduce something in addition to my restaurant class that can maybe change depending on my input. And this is not going to be like as painful as like writing new code for the restaurant all the time. So what we usually do is we create something that's known as the driver code or the parser. So this is the driver code. What it's going to do is now this is going to be specific to the format of my data, right? So I'm going to read this in here using this driver code, right? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to utilize whatever I have, like whatever methodology, whatever attributes, whatever functions I have in my restaurant class here, based on like whatever input I kind of read from the Yelp data, right? So I'm going to import this restaurant class here, which of course I can do because the restaurant class will be saved in a file. And the moment you save something in a file, it becomes a module, right? So I will be able to import that. And next time, right? Next time, whenever like my Yelp data, let's say comes up in my JSON file format, all I have to do is update this, right? Let's say it comes in some other file format, I'll update this. And I will not touch this. So this stays as it is, right? Now, coming to the restaurant class itself, all I need to do is figure out what all defines a restaurant class, what all methodologies we need in my restaurant class, and that's it, right? Then we are done. All we need to do is like create a restaurant class, decide all the attributes, all the data plus procedural attributes plus special methods, and that's it, right? And does not depend on the type of the file that my data is saved in. And what we're going to look at today is like all three pieces. And in addition to that, I'm going to show you like an extra step here, which is of course optional. The whole point of showing you that step is that this is how we can link different classes with one another, right? So we are going to utilize the Point2d class that we just wrote last time, right? And we'll try to import that and utilize that in the restaurant class just to kind of demonstrate how we can use classes within classes, how we can call them from other like modules, and like what all can we do essentially with that, right? So that's what we are going to look at today. So this is a larger like high level picture of what we are doing. I'm going to begin with this one, right? I'm going to begin with this driver code, and this driver code is already provided to you. So you can see this lecture 19, let me show you the name of the file. The lecture 19 restaurant exercise.py, this file is already provided to you, right? And that's what we're going to talk through. So it's the code is already there in that file. You don't have to do much. So there are a couple of things here. First of all, let us assume that restaurant class has been created, and what all it has is the name of the restaurant. Let me show you actually, because we have created it. And so we'll be jumping between these two files, the driver code and the restaurant class, because it's really important to understand what a restaurant class has. Now, based on my Yelp data, I decided that my restaurant needs to have a name, latitude, longitude, address, URL, what category it belongs to, and then scores is nothing but my reviews, right? So I decided that these are the things that my restaurant class needs to have, and that's it. Now notice that this scores is some kind of a combined rating kind of a thing, right? So this can be, so it's totally up to you because you are creating this class, right? So you decided that this can be a list itself, right? That has all those values. Let me show you what values. These numbers, right? So maybe I can create a list that has all these numbers in scores, and that's it, right? I don't have to do a score 1, score 2, score 3, and so on, because that would be like better to deal with, better to manipulate, better to calculate things, and so on. So again, I decided that these are the things that my restaurant will definitely need. So I just like initialize them in my init method. That's all. And this file is also provided to you, and we will add some functionality here, of course, but not all functionality is added yet. So there is a lot we have to do. The second method, as I said, and you should always follow this procedure going forward, is that initialize all your variables. So here I initialized my variables, which is like the things that define my restaurant. And I decided this based on my Yelp data, honestly, right? You can decide it based on your information about that class, based on the information that's provided in a certain problem for you, right? So based on that, I just like decided, okay, these are the things that are required. And okay, so moving on, the other one is the str method. Now notice how complex this looks, right? Actually, what we are doing here is, oh, excuse me, just let me grab water. My throat is like, excuse me. Okay, so notice what we are doing here. And again, it's totally up to us how we want to define this. Maybe you could have like just only an S that says name of the restaurant is this, and that's fine. So the moment somebody prints your restaurant, does like print an instance of your restaurant, only the name will be printed, right? But what I'm doing is I'm saying like I created this string. Notice the string. I created the string. I said name, and then concatenated self.name, which is nothing but the name that I'm going to read in from the instance of my class, right? Plus a \n, right? So that's S. And then notice what's in the second line, what's happening. So in the second line, we are continuously concatenating these strings to that S, so that when I finally go and do a return S, right, it is going to return this long string in a certain format. So you can just like tell the format is going to be the name of the restaurant, latitude, and different lines, right? Because I have a \n there. And there is no reason why we are doing. I just decided that this is how I want to represent my object. It's totally up to you if you don't like this one and want to represent it in something else, in some other ways, right? So this is the way we are doing it. This is not the way of doing it. This is just like one way of doing it, right? Because I decided that let me just go ahead and do it, right? So this shouldn't confuse you at all, but this is just like representing, or this is just like illustrating, I would say, a way of writing these str methods. They can be really complex. You can write a really complex string here, or like how you want your instance of your class to be printed, right? Questions so far about this entire thing that we are doing? I'm going to come to this location in a second. This part here, this is important. Let me see. I don't see any new questions, so I'm assuming there aren't any, but that's fine. You can ask anytime you want. Now, coming to this one field that I just kind of skipped for a second, right? The location part. Now notice that what I'm doing here, whenever I'm going to create an instance of my class, I'm going to do something like this, right? X equals name, latitude, longitude, address, URL, category, score. So it's going to require all of those. Then only it will create my restaurant class, because that's how I defined my init method, correct? All right. But this does not restrict me in terms of how internally I'm going to use this. This never restricts us, because internally what I'm doing is I've created a new variable called self.loc, which is not here. So they don't have to match in any way, right? It's not here. But what I'm doing is I've created this new variable called self.loc, which will be internally referred to, right? And this is of the type Point2d class. Okay, so where did this Point2d come from? I have imported this from my file Point2d. Just like we used to import, if you remember, just like we used to import my functions from my other modules, right? So why do we have to do this? Basically, you have to say from file name, import your class. And why am I doing that in this way? This is to show you that I could have written another class in the same file. I can have another class in the same file. And I could have done from Point2d import that Point2d new class, whatever that class was, right? So I can have multiple classes in the same file, and you can call them like this, right? If I did import Point2d, then it would have imported this, and then I would have to use Point2d dot Point2d, which becomes like really like not as convenient to write, and that's the whole reason why I'm doing from point2d import point2d, right? Because then I can just like directly use this instead of doing a point2d dot point2d, which becomes really weird. All right, let me see. There's a question. Caesar, your question is, can you explain the init is for again? Oh yeah, sure. So the init method, if you remember, why were we using the init method in point2d? If you remember, because we want to initialize our um, class, right? What does initialization mean? Initialization means that whenever you're going to, because this is your own object, right? So obviously, once you've created your own object, for example, when we create a string, I do something like this, right? S equals something. So this is like an instance of my string class, right? So similar to that, you should be able to do S equals some like point2d, because this is your own type, right? And then just like provide like these initialization arguments that are the variables that you initialized in your original point2d class, right? So once I have this, right, s equals point2d 2 and 3, this is referring to the variables that I utilized here to initialize or to create my class. So when we talk about the init method, it is the most basic method, and it is the most important thing that's required whenever we are creating any object. That's the bare minimum that you need when you write your own class, right? You need the init method because you have to refer to your own like instance of that class and also initialize the variables. So that's what init method does, and that's what it's doing here in the restaurant class as well, right? So it's up to you how you want to define your class. For example, I try to define my class using these variables. You can come up with something else, right? But it depends on what object your class represents, because my class represents restaurant, and so I decided that these are the variables that it requires, right? And then going internally, you can have different ways of like handling them. For example, I decided to have all the reviews as like something that's like scores, right? And as I said in that picture that I was drawing, right, a lot of things that are specific to the Yelp data file will be handled in my driver code and not here. Here I'm trying to be as generic as possible, right? All right. So going back, I think I saw another question. Lenny's, your question is, does that mean when you have restaurant, you can just have the location instead of the LON and LAT attributes when calling restaurant? No, it does not mean that. No, it means you have to create the restaurant using whatever you've defined here. Internally, you can like refer to them anyways, but internally when you're using your LOC, you can like refer to it as .loc. For example, I'm doing here in my str. I don't have to use like latitude and longitude because I defined a new variable that uses these LON and LAT, as you can see here. But when you're creating an instance of the class, you cannot refer to LOC because it's internal to your class. So no, you have to use the latitude and the longitude. Yes, exactly. Yes, it just refers to it internally. That's right. That's because like I want to make things convenient for myself internally, right? So that's why I did that. Of course, it's not a requirement, and that's the whole point of today's lecture. This is just like one way. Maybe you can come up with another way of like writing your restaurant class, and that is absolutely correct, right? So this is not just like one correct way of doing this. This is just like demonstrating that this can be done in many ways, and this is just one way. So if you don't like to like use point2d class here, you don't have to. You can just like use latitude and longitude to just create a tuple maybe, right? Just create a tuple self dot loc that's directly a tuple and not even point2d. That's fine, right? As long as you're referring to it correctly within your entire like functions and methods, whatever you're writing. That's it. All right, all excellent questions. So going back to the main file, which is lecture 19 restaurant exercise, let me show you what's happening here. So this is that box when I was drawing that picture. Remember I said this is the driver code. So this file is essentially, it has like, it can contain certain functions that we wrote by keeping in mind that my data is the Yelp data, that my data looks something like this, right? So that is the driver code. Of course, like you might argue that what happens when my Yelp data changes? What happens if it's a different format? Yes, then of course you will have to make changes here. But the whole point of showing you this exercise is that you don't have to change anything here. This will stay the same because I have made it as generic as possible. So now let me see how I can use this first of all. And of course, a lot of things are missing here, so we will be adding them as well. But let me show you how we can use this this class in my driver code, right? So high level, let me write it down. What we will be doing here is just like printing a few things from the restaurant class using the Yelp file. But if you look at this, first of all, of course, importing my restaurant from my restaurant class. And again, I'm using from restaurant, import restaurant to be like have it more convenient when we are calling it, first of all. Second, it just has one class. If it had multiple classes, then I have to think about things, but that's fine, right? So the first function, convert input to restaurant, is nothing but like a parser code that you've looked at before when we were dealing with files, right? So it is going to take one line at a time, just like one line from the Yelp file, right? And we'll have to go and check the Yelp file to see how it looks like. So for example, the Yelp file data was something like name of the restaurant, I don't know, latitude, longitude, something like that, right? And so on, right? And then like eventually we had like the ratings 1, 5, and so on, right? So this, because this is a driver code, this has to be designed based on the way the data is provided to me. And that's exactly what I'm doing here. And this particular function is essentially taking one line from the Yelp file, which is what the input argument is, and creating a restaurant class, right? So this is creating one restaurant class out of one line. Now you can tell that every line in your Yelp data file is going to, like, can be utilized to create a restaurant class, because that's what my restaurant class does, right? So all of this is like pretty straightforward. This we have done before. You just do a dot strip and a dot split by the delimiter, and you get like this list, right, of all the elements where the first one is name and other things and so on, right? So because the first one is name, so I've put name equals that first thing, and then the latitude, the longitude, again, like just pick up the elements from this list that you created, and you're very much familiar with how to do that. All right. The only thing to notice here is this part, right? So remember, like the sixth element here in my Yelp file, the sixth element onwards, right, is the review. So we need that. Remember, the way we decided we will have our restaurant class is that there is just like one, I would say, variable called scores. And we decided maybe we can have it as a list. So I have to take care of that here and create a list. So I've created a list called reviews that has like this, okay, reviews is a list that has like all these ratings in it, right? And I know internally how to handle it in my restaurant class. So all I'm doing is all this function, this convert input to restaurant is doing is just like creating restaurant class out of that one line of Yelp file. So the restaurant class I'm calling here is very easy to now create, because all it needs is name. So name is already like read from this line. The next thing it needs is latitude, the longitude. So we already have the variable. So all I have to do is just like pass the variables here. And it is going to create a restaurant class, right? And what I can do is call this function again and again in a loop maybe, right? To read every line of the Yelp data and create these restaurant classes. And maybe what we are doing here, this is just like one way of doing it. Again, I'm telling you, but you can have some other way of doing it. Is like, for example, one line has one restaurant class, the second line has another instance of the restaurant class, the third line has another instance of the restaurant class. So what I'm doing here is that I can save these restaurants in a list. So restaurant 1, restaurant 2, and so on, right? So each one of them is an instance of my restaurant class, which I'm creating using this convert input to restaurant, right? And then I can create this like huge list that has like all these restaurant classes added to them, right? So that's exactly what we're doing here. Build restaurant list. Let me show you what we're doing here. Okay, so first of all, this thing, I'm assuming this thing is clear to everybody before we move further. This should be clear to everyone, right? Okay, if there are no questions, then I'm assuming this is clear. Then this next function is doing nothing, but just taking in the Yelp file name and calling this function from here, right? And just creating this restaurants list, as I said, that has all these instances of my restaurant class. And how do I create those instances? By using the Yelp file, right? And then, okay, so let's assume that we have all of this created here, just this part and this part, right? So let me assume I just created this part. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to read the file, which is yelp.txt, which is already there in my computer. And notice what I'm doing here. Just calling this build restaurant list, and again, putting it in this variable restaurants, which is again going to create a list because this returns a list, right? So all of this like we are familiar with. And I'm going to print like the first 3 restaurants and see what happens, right? So here I'm just like printing the first 3, obviously, because Yelp is a huge file. I don't want to print all of them, right? So let me just like print the first 3. All right, so there are a few things that we need to look at when we printed it, right? So I said for I in range, go to this restaurant list and then go and print this thing. Can anybody tell me why the printed format is like this? Why is the printed format like this? Where exactly did we specify that this is the restaurants will be printed like this? Lennis, you're correct. Excellent. Because we created a restaurant class where we specified in my Str method that this is how my restaurant should look like whenever somebody prints them, right? And that's exactly what we are doing here. Now we have, of course, gone another level in the sense that we have this list of all these instances, right? But that list will have these these instances of my restaurant class. So when I print them, it goes and checks how I should print an object of the type restaurant, and that's what gets printed here. All right, so there are a few more like exercises that are added here. The first one is like just a demo that we can add more functionality here using my restaurant class itself. So I can go and add some functionality here in the sense that let's say I wanted to find which is the top rated restaurant in this file, right? And maybe I want to also find out, I want to let the user add a city name, and based on that, in that city, I want to find, let's say, a restaurant that has like the highest rating. So, well, there are again, multiple ways of doing it. So this is not the way of doing it, but we are just showing you one, right? One way could have been go inside this like restaurants, whatever list we have created, and then get the reviews, right? Get the reviews and then like calculate the average rating and get the one that has the max. That could have been one way, right? But now we have like this added filter of like go and find out the highest rated restaurant in a city. So maybe this will become tedious. And this is like up to my judgment. I'm not saying that this is going to be tedious for everybody. So this is according to my judgment that I decided, okay, this is not going to be as easy. So let me do one thing. Let me go and add a functionality to my class itself. How about I add this functionality to my class where I kind of say, okay, whether this exists in a city or not, right? So that's what we have done here. Whether R, so here we are checking if R is in city or not, right? If it is in that city or not. And so what we have to do is we have to go and check, can we get the name of the city from like whatever information we have, right? And then the other thing is that we'll have to go and check the average review as I said. So one way is to go and pick these average values that we have and keep checking, right? The average, like keep calculating the average values, which will become tedious. So because I thought that this is like really difficult, what we can do is we can go and add that functionality here. Why aren't we adding that functionality here? Like whether this exists in a city or not, whether this is, I don't know, like whether like the review of one is greater than the other or not. So basically what my restaurant class is going to do, it is going to have the average review calculated for one instance of my restaurant class. And then I can just like go and compare those, right? So let me do that. Let me just give me a second. I'll grab water. My throat is like really dry, and then we can. All right, thank you for the patience. Sorry. Okay, so the first method that I'm adding, and of course, this is like not the only way of doing it, is that first I'm going to check if a city name, which is like, notice this input here, city name, whether that exists in like whether my restaurant exists in that city or not. So that's the first method that I'm going to write. And the way like I've designed it is that it's going to return a true if the restaurant is in the given city, otherwise not, right? So first, let's try to understand how we have saved this information, right? Because I have to sort of scan through, and let's look at this line here, right? So I have to scan through this entire line, notice, and then get this like Troy, for example, right? And then I have to get it for any instance that like somebody has created. So how do we extract that depending on the way I have my data saved in my like Yelp file? So let me show you what I'm trying to say. Okay. What I'm saying is, once we did that dot split by this delimiter, right? We will get like this address in some ways, right? We will get this address in a, like one element of that is going to be this particular list, right? And if you go back and check the way we have the address, let me show you the way we are reading an address. Okay, where is the driver? Okay, here. Okay, so we decided that we are like further going to split the address by that plus sign. So what I'm trying to say is again that this depends on my driver code. So what this will do is my address will be something like this. Okay, so when we did this like dot split by a plus, right? So then my address will look something like this, like whatever street, something like some street, right? And then comma, this is going to have like Troy, and then New York, whatever address, and something like this. So I want to go in and pull this variable, right? And extract this value from that variable, which is like a list type, and then go and check whether this is that particular city or not. So let's see how we can extract that. So what I can do is I have to pick the last element of this list, correct? Like this is the last element of this list, which is going to be like Troy, comma, New York, whatever, right? So this is going to be the last element. And then if I split by a comma, right, and get the first element of that, because if I split by a comma, again, I'm going to get like Troy and then New York, whatever, like this. And then I can pick the 0th element from there. So step one, pick the last element from address, split it by comma, and then get the first element from that. Again, I have to do it like this because I made a decision at some point to read the address like this. If you made some other decision of reading the address in some other way, then you'll have to figure out how you will extract the name of the city from that object type, right? So based on like what decision I made, I'm going to write this here, right? So let's write that down. Let me extract the city, which is going to like maybe saved in a variable because I have to compare that with like city name here, right? And so that's exactly what I'm going to do. Okay, I thought maybe there are questions, but that's fine. I'm defining this my city equals, and what I thought was I have this like self dot address. So let me get self dot address, and let me get the last element of that because that was my last element in there. So -1, and then do a dot split by comma because that's how I saved it essentially, right? So this is like not the only solution of doing it, but this is like one way of doing it. So my city will be saved in this one, and then I can go and compare it with the city name, right? So essentially I can do is return my city equals city name. All right. So if I like if they are the same, then this is going to return a true. Otherwise, it's going to return a false, right? So because I designed my solution in this way for this problem, right? Because somebody enters a city name, right? I have to go and check whether like what all restaurants exist in that city. Again, like I know I'm repeating this multiple times, but this is not the only way of doing it. This is just like one way of doing it. And I'm trying to create my restaurant class, which is as generic as possible. So I wanted this functionality to be there in the restaurant class. So it becomes easier here. Now, how has it become easier here? Now notice, my restaurant class has this method dot is in city. All I have to do in my driver code is call that is in city with some city name. And that's going to return this like true or false for me. Right, so I've made it easier instead of like going through this long list of all the restaurants and checking what all exist in my city and then doing things. This is similar to what we have done with other object types that exist in Python. For example, if I go and create a string, right, and then I have like some um, let's say the task is to go and count the number of e's in this string. All I have to do is just like go ahead and do an s dot count, right? Because that dot count method has already been created in the type string, and I can easily use it. Otherwise, I would have to loop through this string and go and keep counting the e's. Oops. Yeah, whatever that was. And get the output, right? So that's what this is demonstrating. It just like made our task easier. And it's totally up to the programmer how they would like to build on what they see that like the functionality that they require in their restaurant class and then use it, right? Questions, doubts? John, your question is, do we need to write an equal to function in class? You don't need to write any of these except the init method. To be very honest, all you need, if you're really like saying that what is required, if the question is asking about what is required, then all you need is this like init, right? But okay, so if you're asking about like the equal to method, um, I think this is pretty basic. Why do we need that underscore equal to? We needed it in Point2d class because we wanted to use that for my Point2d class. Now, what is my city here? My city is just a string. And the equal to method already exists for a string type. I'm not comparing my restaurant types here. I'm just comparing a string with a string. So I don't need to write this equal to method anywhere. We only need those special methods when we are using those methods for the classes that we have created. If I was asking you to compare a restaurant with a restaurant type, right, then you will definitely need the equal to method, but now you don't need it because you have to see what you're comparing. What exactly are you comparing here, right? So what we are comparing here is a string with a string, and Python knows how to compare strings with a string. So I don't think we need it here. All whenever you're writing, as again I'm repeating, all you mostly need is the init method and the str method. The rest are up to us depending on like what functionality we need to add. In some cases, sometimes we don't even need the str method. I mean, going as far. It totally depends on like what functionality we want to add. All right. Any other questions before we move on? Okay, let me see if I've like missed out anything before. Okay, so we already saw this convert input to, I think I saw a question. Caesar, you're saying, would you suggest we put a dot strip in? Yeah, I think we should, definitely. I think maybe I forgot. You're right. Maybe we can put a dot strip here. That's always, I mean, I would say useful. Even if there is no spacing, that's always good to use. So you can definitely like that's recommended. I don't remember if we need it in this file, but that's recommended always. So always use it dot strip whenever you can. All right. Let me quickly just like scroll through. Um, Build restaurant list. Okay, we have talked through the parser code, which is the lecture 19 restaurant exercise.py file. Now we are adding some functionality to our restaurant class, right? So let me go back to this and see if we have talked about this. Okay, so I have a way to find out whether this particular restaurant is like it exists in a city or not, right? Now, next what I'm checking is, let me go and find out the top rated restaurant, right? So I need a way to calculate the average rating because once I have the average rating, then only I can go and compare them. Because right now I don't have the average rating. The way I've like decided to get everything in is just this variable scores. right? I have the single variable scores and I'm just like putting everything in it, right? And I haven't like really utilized it in any way. And when I'm like comparing so many restaurants here, first of all, if you go back to this like restaurants list that we are creating using the Yelp data. If you look at this, it has all the instances of my restaurant class, but there is no way to extract like these reviews. Like there is no way, like this just goes and creates a restaurant class, and of course it's an object, and of course you can print it, right? But there is no way you can extract the reviews and use them. So that's another issue that's happening here. And so obviously we'll have to go and do something about it. All right, so I'm doing one thing about it, that is like calculate and return the average rating for one instance of my restaurant class. And if I'm able to do that for one instance, then I can go and access it here, right? This is also an important point, by the way, because in restaurants, in my restaurant class, I haven't defined a way to extract these reviews. There is no way I can extract these reviews. All right, so going back to my average review, how can we calculate the average review? What is essentially the average review? Average review is nothing but like the sum of all the reviews divided by the number of reviews that we have, right? But there were certain restaurants that did not have a rating at all. So when I'll start reading the Yelp data, there will be those restaurants where like this will not have any value, right? So we have to take care of that case as well. Let me do that then. So let me write here. Okay, so the way we are calculating the average review is that if my length of self dot reviews, because that's how I'm creating my class, in the sense that I will always create a list out of it. And that was demonstrated here, right? I am creating a list of my reviews. That's all I have. So I know that that's a list, right? And so what I'll do is, if the length of this like self.reviews is 0, then just return a -1 to indicate that this restaurant has no rating, right? And otherwise, in the rest of the cases, just go and calculate it, right? So I'm going to round it up to 2 decimal places. Again, it's up to me how I want to like use this. It's not something that you have to do, right? And so what I'm doing is sum up the self.reviews, because that's the formula of average, right? And divided by the length of self.reviews. And that's it, right? Divided by the length of reviews, rounded up to 2 decimal places, and that's fine. And of course, like this is optional. It depends on like how exactly I want my method to be created. All right, let's just like go and run this one before we add other methods here, because we have now also notice we have something below this if name equals main. Let's also discuss this. There are two things. Now, when we were looking at that picture, remember there is this code that's the driver code, which is in my lecture 19 restaurant exercise.py, and then there is the class. But then that class will be utilized here, right? And before we utilize it in any other file, before we utilize it in like any other parser code, we have to test our restaurant class as we are building it, correct? And in order to do that, we will have the guard, which is extremely important here. You can tell because I don't want my testing code to be called here. So I have to put everything below this if name equals me. And then I'm testing for small instances here. And this is how you should proceed even on your homework. What you should do is once you started creating this class and you know that it is going to be called somewhere and used somewhere, all of that is fine, but always test it here, right? So what we're doing here is that we have like pulled up some data from the existing Yelp file, and then we have created these inputs in the way that we are expecting the input to come in, right? And then just like created, for example, I just created one instance of my restaurant class and see if like these methods work fine or not. For example, this method of latitude, longitude, min review, max review, and we can even add like the average review here, right? So let's actually go in and add all this min review, max review, all of the methods here, and then let's test it. And once we've tested it, then we're going to go back to our driver code and run this entire thing, right? To find out like which is the best restaurant in a city of my choice. Okay, So let's go and do that. So the next method that we want to add is like which one has the minimum review, right? And let's do this. Which one has the minimum review? So any suggestions on how we can find the min review? Now that you know how to find the average reviews, this should be pretty easy. Which restaurant, let's say, maybe we are trying to find out which restaurant in a given city has a smallest review. This should be pretty easy to find. First of all, let's have like again. Let me see. A lot of you gave some suggestions. Daniel, you're saying min self-reviews. Yeah, I think I agree with that. Rochelle, you're right. Smallest. So we're not looking at the smallest average review for all restaurants. This is for one instance of a restaurant. What is the min review that this restaurant got? I think maybe the question wasn't clear, right? So it's asking us to write a method called min review that returns the minimum review for that particular restaurant, and then a -1 if there are no reviews, right? So let's do that. All we have to do is like add this structure here. Why? Because we want to return this -1 if there was no review. And one way to check that is just like go and check the reviews list, right? It has like length is 0, just return that. Otherwise, what you have to do is just as Daniel, you suggested, I would go with that. So just like return min of self.reviews, right? So just do a min self.reviews because I would already have it in the form of like a list, right? So yeah, this one. All right. So similar to that, we can do a max, right? Return -1, otherwise just like do a max. So I'm just like copying this and instead of like a min, have a max. Right, so this is straightforward. Now, this was like added on purpose, and this was added because what if I'm interested in the latitude or the longitude of my restaurant class, right? And this was like to demonstrate how we can call that. Now, going back, and I want to extract the latitude, but remember, and this question was also asked earlier, internally we are referring to the latitude and the longitude together as this variable called LOC. Let me go back and show you. So this LOC has like this Point2d type, remember? And this is a little more complex than you might think it is. This LOC is of the type Point2d. So it depends on how we define Point2d. And Point2d object has like two values. Whenever we call my Point2d object, it has like my X and my Y, right? So that's exactly what I'm doing here. I am returning myself.loc.y because that's what latitude is, and the longitude is self.loc.x. Now, let's say you decided that you don't want to save it as a Point2d object, you want to save it as a tuple. Like instead of this, you want to save it as a tuple, right? And so you'll have like longitude and latitude. And the way you will call that here is that instead of saying self.loc.y, you would have said like self.loc and then like element first, right? Or element second, because now it's a tuple. So that's the only difference that should happen here, depending on the object type that is like representing your location. Okay, so I think we have pretty much everything that we need for this like minimal testing to go on, just to make sure that everything is working fine before we run it for the larger file, right? So for example, we are running the first one that has like some data here, right? The second one was added that had no reviews just to test like that no review also works fine. And there's just like printing all those methods, right? Dot latitude, dot longitude, dot min review, dot max review, and all of that. Okay. So of course we can test the like dot average review as well, but anyways, that is tested here in the driver code that we are going to look at. Any questions before we move on? Okay, so the important thing to notice here, like all these methods, all these functionalities that were added to my restaurant class, right? They will work on one instance of my class. For example, in my testing code here, this was one instance of my class that I created and I saved it in my REST1, right? So my REST1 has one instance of the restaurant class that has like all this information. Similar to that, like my REST2 has like another instance of my restaurant class that has all this information here. And similar to that, my list restaurants here, my list restaurants in which I appended like this each line, every element of that list is of like it's an instance of my restaurant class. So why is it so important? It's important because now I can directly apply all the methods that are there in my restaurant class to each of the element of my restaurants list, right? Because this, in fact, this restaurant list. No, I know I'm repeating everything, but this restaurant list has some elements, right? And so those elements are like instances of my restaurant class. For example, rest1, rest2, rest3, depending on like how many values are there in my Yelp data. So when I loop through this list, let's say the name of the list is R, which is referring to restaurants, right? So when I go for variable in R or restaurants, whatever you like to call it, right? This I is referring to this and this and this. So why is this good? That's because like I can do an I dot average review. I dot is in city. All the methods that I created in my restaurant class. Because that's all I need now. I know that these are the objects of that type, and I already added some functionality for that object type. I can directly use it. And that's exactly what we're doing here. So let me go back and see what we're doing here. This was just like printing, so we are already done with that. Here is the main code, right? Here's the main code. So what I want to do is I want to find the top rated restaurant in a city. And I'm going to ask the user to enter that city, right? And do a dot strip directly here. And I'll begin by creating this string where I'm going to keep the name of the top restaurant and the best rating. This strategy has been used multiple times before in order to find a max or min given a list of values or a string of values. So we are using the exact same strategy. Initialize with the name and the top average rating. Whenever a better one is found, update them. Whenever a better one is found, just update them. That's exactly what we're doing here. Initialization, looping through the restaurant list, and then just checking if the city name is not matching with the city name of the first element of restaurants. Just skip that. Just continue means just like skip this part. Let's say the restaurant exists in that city, right? That is in city is true. Let's say that that's the case. Then I'm going to get the average review of that restaurant, which is very easy now because I have that method defined in my restaurant. I don't have to go and pull anything from my list. All I have to do is just do an r dot average review, right? And just compare it with my initialization variables. Obviously, if a higher rating is found, just update these variables. Keep updating these variables depending on if something is found. And then finally do a print. This is something that we already know, right? Similar to this, let's say we wanted to add some other functionality to my restaurant class. We wanted to extract some other information from my restaurant classes. I could have directly gone and added something in my restaurant class instead of my driver code. Because then in my driver code, it really becomes easy to pull everything just by doing a dot method, right? Just by doing a dot method, I can get all the information. So it's important that if we are working with instances of a certain class that we have created, put more and more functionality in your class instead of putting it in the driver code, because then that makes it like, more, difficult to kind of handle. Okay, let me take questions and then we can go on. Lenny, your question is the restaurant list has the restaurants as objects that you can call. I think I talked about that earlier, right? When I drew that picture. And we talked about this build restaurant list function. What we are doing here in this, let me repeat it. That's fine. No problem at all. Let's repeat it. That's absolutely fine. And good thing that you asked that question. So let me just go over this one more time. So like step one, like everybody's okay with the restaurant object itself, right? So let's say we have that object and we have like all the functionality in there, right? And now what I'm doing is I have this driver code, which is called lecture 19 restaurant exercise.py, right? And so this first function was all it was doing was taking one line of Yelp and doing like all the splitting and getting the name, the latitude, all the information, and creating an instance of my restaurant class. right? Only one instance from one line, right? One instance from one line of Yelp, right? Now, what I'm doing here in this next function, and of course, it's up to you whether you want to design it like this or not. So what I'm doing here is that I will read an entire file, right? Call my convert to input restaurant, which was just creating one instance from one line of Yelp. But I'm going to run that function for the entire file of Yelp, right? And like begin with this empty list called restaurants. So I'm beginning with this empty list of restaurants and then appending like every instance that I'm calling using the convert input to restaurant and appending it to restaurants. So that's how my restaurants list has these instances of my restaurant class. Is that clear now? Because I already created that functionality in my driver code. And why I'm repeating this again and again, because you might have to think through, right? You might have to think through how you are going to handle your data, what is going to be your driver code, and what is going to be the functionality of your object type when you're doing homework 8. So that's why I'm like repeating these things again and again, because there is a certain format in which the data is presented to you, but you don't want to make this driver code extremely complex. For example, I wanted to compare like which restaurant has which is the top rated restaurant. I don't want to add like more complex code here, scanning through like these restaurant types. It's always better to go and add functionality to your class because it becomes so much easier then that you can just like do a dot method and get whatever information you need. And that's exactly what we're doing here. Just like I'm doing an r dot is in city, r dot average review. Maybe I wanted to find out whether like which has the max rating, which has the min rating. All of those are very easy now because I have like these methods here. Maybe I wanted to find out like which of the restaurants are like really close in close proximity to one another. So what I'll do is I'll use these methods, latitude, longitude, and calculate the distance using the Point2d class. How about that? Right, so all of that is doable because I've added all the functionality in my class. Okay, so going back to the lecture notes, let me see if we have anything. And so, like, again, this is like a subjective question, I would say. It's not an objective question in the sense that, like, what functionality do you need in the restaurant class? Well, it depends on how you want to design your restaurant class. Maybe you decided that your restaurant class will only have the name. And maybe you wanted to have the rest of the functionality in your driver code, which is absolutely fine. But then you have to see in terms of reusability of your restaurant class, which is why I want to add more and more functionality in my restaurant class because it should be reusable. My driver code is like heavily dependent on the way my file, my Yelp file is given to me, right? But my restaurant class is not. So like if somebody gives me some other format with the same information, like with the name and all of the other things about a restaurant, I can still just like go and update this file here and use this restaurant.py or my restaurant class. So that's like the high level idea of creating your own objects. Okay, so that was the functionality. And then we already looked at the actual restaurant class with why the init method is in a certain way, how to call another class in your class. So those are the things that we are learning with this, right? How to design your object type, how to call another class into this and use that, right? And again, I mean, this is totally up to you. This is totally up to you. Maybe you decide to have a list of the locations, and that's absolutely fine, as long as you know how to access that. And as long as like you're consistent with the way you're using it within your class and outside, right? So all of that, there is nothing special about working, as I said, because like they might feel more complicated, but actually they are not. I would say they're like really making our life easier in the sense that the more functionality I'm adding to my class, right? It's like really easier for me when I like call those methods. So like all my work should go into my object type. All right. We already added, like this was the in-class example where we wanted to add is in city method and the average review method, but in fact, we added other methods as well, just to give you a good idea of like what's going on here. I mean, yeah, you can think of like more functionality to your restaurant class and add it, and that's absolutely fine. Okay. Yeah, this is important. And this, I think this question will come to you when you are doing your homeworks and even your labs, what is not in the restaurant class, right? And why? And why should we've put something versus the other? Why did we decide to have this address like this versus like some other way? And again, I wouldn't say there is a right and wrong answer to that question. It's more around how do you want to design that? And my recommendation, like for even for the homework, and let me write it down, is something like this. Let's say you read the homework, we will ask you to write certain classes. So you know that like you need to have like class 1, right? And you need to have class 2. And it won't hurt if you go and like draw this like high level picture, right? And have like some data. Let's say the data is given to you, right? So figure out what all functionality your class 1 and your class 2 should have, and whether this data should be directly linked to these classes, or if not, like, do you need a parser code? Like my recommendation in general is to have this parser code, because everything that is associated with data can be handled here in your parser. So you'll have a separate file there, and you'll be calling your classes here to do whatever you need to do. But once you have like figured these pieces, especially like what all functionality your classes need, most likely, as far as I remember, the homework talks about like what all functionality you need to add in each of these classes. And there would be some that would be left to you to go and add. So like there are two parts to it. My recommendation is go and add as much functionality as you can here. Keep the parser simple in terms of like this should focus only on like this file type. Most likely it's going to be a txt file. So the parser should be like focused on getting the data, parsing the data, putting it like in a certain format, maybe creating like class 1, class 2 object types, right? Once you have those object types, you can utilize because like you will have these methods inside these classes. So once you have the parser, you can just like maybe create a list, or maybe create a dictionary or something that has like these object types as class 1 and class 2. And these class 1 and class 2 already have these methods in them, which you can utilize, right? So this is what this like discussion here is all about. Like first try to figure out the different pieces of your program before going and jumping into the code. Because once you start working with classes, it becomes overwhelming. And again, like I'm kind of pointing you to the homework. It may become overwhelming, but it won't once you have a clear picture of what's happening there. So it's better to kind of sit down for like half an hour and then figure out these boxes here and what all needs to go where, and then begin writing your code. And that's exactly what we did in restaurant class. My restaurant class does not have the line parsing. You may want to have it there. Usually we don't want the class tied to that particular form of input, as we said earlier, because that would be restricted to my Yelp file. What if like somebody gave me a JSON file tomorrow? Then my restaurant class wouldn't be as useful. And where are we getting like this idea of making it generic? Well, we are getting this idea from the existing Python classes. I have a class like a list, right? And list is not restricted by any input type. List methods are not restricted by any input type. They just exist. And once you create a list, you can use it like whatever that list is. So that's the fundamental idea of creating classes. Make it as generic as possible. Well, there is an like alternative. We can add a method that can handle different types of input. So maybe create a function that handles a JSON file, a TXT file, and reads it and create like these instances of your restaurant class. It's optional. I mean, if that seems more convenient to you, go ahead and do that. Okay, so this point is extremely important, and you will face this a lot. It's not as straightforward. You will face it when writing your own classes. The decision about what should be inside and what should be outside. And in most cases, it depends on you. There is no right or wrong answer to this question. It depends on you, what you feel is more convenient. This idea of encapsulation comes in. We want to encapsulate more and more functionality into the classes, but sometimes it's not feasible. Sometimes it makes your code more complex. For instance, if I had this, where is that gone? This convert to restaurant, I feel it would have like made my class more complex instead of making it simple. So that's why I had this function here. But then this is not restricting you from not having it here. So, I mean, this question is the hardest part when we start writing classes, because it is giving you that power, that flexibility to go and create your own methods, create your own functions. But then that flexibility comes in with a price, because you have to figure out what to put where, right? And it's not such a straightforward thing to do. All right, another like example is the method we wrote to test if a restaurant is in a particular city or not. I think we talked about this, right? I could have like accessed the list of the restaurant object types, and like when we were creating that list, we can have like scanned through that and checked like the city. But then again, depends on us, right? How do we want to add that? This is also important. Like I decided to read the address in a particular way. Let me show you what I mean. I made the address like very generic, in the sense that address could be anything, right? I'm not putting any restriction on that. Address is just an address. It could be a string type, it could be a list. I haven't put any restriction on that here. And then I decided I will read it as a list. I will create a list of an address. An alternate could be that we can create an object or an like a object type that's an address, like another class address, and that has like street address, city, zip, state, and so on. Right? You can create that, like create an init method with all that information, and then call it here. So then it won't be like as simple, because like I won't say simple, but then it will be more generic, in the sense that there is this existing class address, and then you're calling it here and then using it, right? So that's an alternate, and maybe you can try like create a class here, class that's an object address, and then call it here, or maybe create it in another module. Again, like so much flexibility, we can do so much with like classes, and that's the whole point of today's lecture. Yeah, so we already talked about this, like we can add an address class. In summary, and again, in summary, I would say that what classes are giving us is the power of flexibility. And we have to use that carefully, in the sense that the design part of classes in itself requires a lot of work. And it wouldn't hurt if we put some time in designing our solution when using classes, rather than going and like jumping into the coding part. And that's what we looked at in today's lecture. Some of the important components of any class are attributes, methods, and then special methods with the underscores, right? You know that those are the operators that already exist and we are overloading them. So that's what special methods are. And what we looked at in today's lecture was like classes containing other objects as attributes, list of class objects, the restaurant list, right? And how can we design Python classes? There is no one way, but always start by outlining how they should be used, and then that should lead to your final design method. Always like write it down, what all functionality needs to be added, and then go and start writing code. Okay, so that's it. That's it from my end. That's like a demonstration of how you should go forward when you're utilizing classes and their interaction. And I think that's it for like classes as well. So yeah, that's it for today's lecture. Thank you everybody for joining. If you have any questions, you can stay back. I also have office hours at 12. Feel free to join in if you have any more questions. And thank you so much, everybody.